Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nicholas Corcel and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we're going to be continuing the trend of the last few videos and talk more about Mao II by Don DeLillo. In today's episode we're going to be focusing on chapter 2, part 1. And in this chapter we start out in a dark room alone with the man that is talked about in the first chapter. Really introduced to Bill Gray, the novelist who becomes the central protagonist of the story in the most intimate and well-rounded way yet. And on this first page of this chapter, we also get some of the best writing I've ever seen that really digs into the reclusive nature of his personality and thoroughly explores how he's struggling to stick to the routines that have made him who he is. He's struggling to continue to produce great literary works, and really he's just struggling in the broadest sense of the word. And so I'll read this passage. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's definitely worth it. And so it goes, and he is referring to Bill Gray. He resolved to count to 10, and if the lights did not appear, he would go to the desk and turn on the lamp and do some work, going over what he'd written during the day, the scant drip, the ooze of speckled matter, the blood sneeze, the daily pale secretion, the bits of human tissue sticking to the page. He counted to 10, and when no lights showed, he began to count to 10 once more. Slower now, standing in the dark, making an agreement with himself that this time he would really go to the desk and turn on the lamp if the car did not appear at the top of the hill by the time he reached 10. The mud spattered compact, and settled down to work because it was only children who thought they could make things happen by counting. Then he went to 10 one more time, and then one more time, and then just stood watching until the headlights finally showed, splashy white, the car dipping up the rim of the hill, and the lights sweeping briefly across the scrub, and strange children at that, squinters and crappers, the ones who'd ball up their fists when they cry. And so I think, this passage works on a variety of levels. So we have Bill, he's standing there in the upstairs portion of his home, and he's watching the driveway, waiting for Scott and Britta to come for the photography session that he has agreed to do, his first in many, many years. And he sits there and he says, okay, I'm going to look and I'm going to think for 10 more seconds. And if they don't come, I'm going to go back to work. And his work almost takes a physical life form in a sense, where he talks about how the blood sneeze, the daily pale secretion, and the human tissue sticking to the page. So he's literally harming himself to create this work. And as he writes more, pieces of his human tissue, of his personhood, of not only his personality, but of his physical manifestation as a man, is bleeding into this page, bleeding into this book that he hasn't published, this book that he's been working on for 20 years. And then we get this commentary on procrastination, this really beautiful postmodern commentary on procrastination. And so he says, I'm going to count to 10, and if they don't show up, I'm going to go to work. So 10's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, they're not here, but let me count to 10 one more time. 1, 2. He goes through it again. One more time. 1, 2. One more time. One more time. And then eventually he just says, to hell with it. I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to watch the headlights until they come. And eventually they do. But I think as writers or creatives or academics, whatever we do, everything involves a degree of procrastination. Even something that we love. I've worked on projects that I am incredibly passionate about, that I love the work that I'm doing. But the times I'll say, okay, I'm going to watch one more minute of this video, or whatever, and 2-3 hours pass by. And we resist the work because the work involves putting ourselves out there. We don't want to do the thing from which we will be judged. So for a writer, you're judged by your novels, A writer who doesn't write is viewed as lazy, but that's a far better criticism than being the writer who published and his book is bad. Like I would much rather somebody say, "Oh, you're lazy," than "Oh, your writing sucks." And so it's a much safer, almost cowardly route to not publish or to not do the work, whatever that work is, whether it's video making, research, whatever, anything you're doing. It's cowardly, but it's also. It's a form of self-preservation, to not produce, to abstain, and to procrastinate. And I think that's why, in many ways, the default human state is to procrastinate. And this passage is kind of wrapped up by Bill comparing himself to a child, the squinters and the crappers, the ones who ball up their fists when they cry. Kind of honing in on, that idea of, writers and creatives kind of being big babies who are amazing at one thing, but, struggle with like the basics of life in many ways. And so next they pull in the driveway and they walk inside. Scott and Karen are now in the house with Bill and Karen Janey, who is revealed to be Scott's girlfriend. And the interesting part here is that Britta is not allowed to meet Bill at this point. So Bill was up in his room procrastinating from his writing and watching the driveway for her to arrive. But when she arrives, he does nothing with that information. He makes no effort to go downstairs and speak to her. All he has to do is literally walk from upstairs to downstairs. 10 steps at most. And he can meet her. But he does not do it. And when asked directly about this, Scott says that Bill is upstairs hiding, but don't worry, tomorrow you get your pictures. And that's on page 30 of the book that I'm reading. And it's just very odd, there's this dissonance that's beginning to form. And dissonance is a theme that is used commonly throughout this novel, mainly in the dichotomy between the terrorist and the novelist, or, who is the quote-unquote great artist of the modern generation, or of the postmodern generation. Regardless, they keep talking. Bill seems like he's a little bit scared to meet Britta. And we find out why pretty quickly. So Scott talks about how in the 60s somebody sent a severed finger in the mail. So Bill is at the level of fame that, it's very dangerous for him to be exposed in the way that he's exposed in this way with Britta coming. Britta is quite literally putting Bill's life under duress by being there. Of course, we kind of think, Britta's not going to do anything, but Bill doesn't know that. Bill doesn't know her. Bill knows her only as a photographer, which I'm sure adds a level of safety to her because her work is fairly well known. She's photographed other writers and nothing has happened to them. But it could expose Bill's whereabouts. It could expose his locations. And, it really is placing this whole operation that he has set up in upstate New York at extreme risk. Additionally, it is around this point where Scott shows Britta the metal filing cabinet system where they itemize all of Bill's files and magazine articles, mail from readers, all of those things. It's all organized in an analog manner. And he talks about how there were old handwritten manuscripts, printers, typescripts, master galleys. There were reviews of Bill's novels, interviews with former colleagues and acquaintances. There were stacks of magazines and journals containing articles about Bill's work and about his disappearance. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. His concealment, his retirement, his alleged change of identity, his rumored suicide, his return to work, his work in progress, his death, his rumored return. Scott read excerpts from some of these pieces. Then they carried their wine glasses out along the hall where there were shelves filled with book-length studies of Bill's work and work about his work. This passage about Bill's collection of resources and sources about his disappearance really fascinated me. But as I read the novel, I kind of struggled to articulate what I thought about it and why. And so I started to look for some secondary sources or just online discussion about it. And for readers that are trying to get more out of their books, especially people that are young or maybe haven't went through a graduate program. I have not. I just have a bachelor's in English. Definitely use outside resources, and definitely don't be afraid to use things like Reddit to spark the ideas in your mind. Of course, these aren't peer-reviewed sources, but you can get people's ideas, and then you can use those ideas to build your own ideas. And as long as you're fact-checking them with reputable sources and things like that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And so I found this awesome write-up about this on the Don DeLillo subreddit. And this guy's talking about how that passage that I just read to you reminds him of a quote that was attributed to Pynchon in 1997. And in the quote, Pynchon says, "My belief is that the quote-unquote recluse is a code word generated by journalists," meaning somebody who, quote-unquote, again, doesn't like to talk to reporters. And so this writer on Reddit, he talks about how the consensus on Bill Gray in these circumstances is that he's a composite of these various writers, Salinger, Pynchon, and Rushdie, though Of course, he's also part of DeLillo's own imagination, as any writer would be. And then he further talks about another really interesting interview from 1991 called Conversations with Don DeLillo. And the quote that I'm about to read you is from Gerald Howard, the guy who edited DeLillo's very, very famous book, Libra. And he says, on the grubby commercial level, and again, this is Gerald Howard talking, editor of Libra, there's going to be a lot of buzz about Bill Gray and who he's meant to be. What parts of Ben have been taken from Pynchon and Salinger and so on. But I think this is a book about Salman Rushdie in a way. Don was very upset about the Rushdie business, and I think that you can sense that feeling of threat all the way through Mao II. And the Rushdie incident that he's talking about here is one of the most interesting and horrific things that has probably ever happened in the literary world. It's this guy who was writing fairly mundane books, and I don't mean mundane in an insulting way. I mean mundane in the sense that what he was writing wasn't among the most controversial things ever written. People have written far darker things about it, but why that matters is that he was eventually stabbed for his work. He was attacked while he was about to give a speech, and I'll link some sources there, and I'm not going to bog down this video too much talking about that, but that's absolutely insane. It's a very rare incident where a writer is paying a physical price for his work. So right here we talk about a metaphorical physical price where Bill Gray's human tissue is on the page and it's like bleeding into the typewriter, bleeding into the page. We see that kind of metaphorically used, and then with Salman Rushdie we see it physically used. And so I think that provides a lot of interesting foreshadowing for maybe where this story is going, and also the ideas that DeLillo wants you to think about as you progress through it. So definitely keep that in the back of your mind as you work through the book with me in this series. And also, I would strongly encourage you to, before you continue reading the book much further, really research that Salman Rushdie incident, and I think you'll find it to be both very interesting as well as horrific, but enlightening as you read the rest of the book. And then the last thing I really want to talk about in this video is this scene towards the end of the chapter where Karen Janey is sat up watching TV. She does something that I think beautifully illustrates modern culture, like right now, which is crazy because this book is very old. But DeLillo nailed where the culture was headed, and we see that they're fully here now. And so Karen is watching TV, and so she picks up the TV remote and she turns the volume down. Touch, 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 until it was totally off. Reading directly from the page, Scott's head was flat in the pillow and he was already halfway gone. She was watching the world news of the day. On any given day, it was mainly the film footage she wanted to see, and she didn't mind watching without sound. It was interesting how you could make up the news as you went along by sticking to picture only. And so this works on two ways. DeLillo introduces this idea of Scott sleeping so that the scene is not super heavy-handed. It would be very odd if Karen just got up and turned the volume down because she liked it. That would feel like he was forcing his point that he's trying to make here. And so we introduced Scott sleeping to give the plot a reason for the volume to go down, but really that's not why it's down. The volume is turned down because what they're saying doesn't matter. News and the mainstream media and the central locus of our world's culture right now, I think you could say, doesn't matter what people are saying. It's all a series of images, interconnected images. And this book focuses extensively on this idea of image events, mass hysteria, this kind of idea that what used to be, this could shape culture, this shaped the way that we viewed the world, is now a series of images. What used to be a great novel or a great investigative journalism piece, these have been replaced by sensationalist images. And in today's context, it's TikToks. You see a massive terrorist attack or a war begins, and how do you figure it out? You find out by watching videos on TikTok or X or all of these types of platforms. You're scrolling through your Twitter feed and you see like kids dying. The world is crazy now, the way that all of these things are just so accessible, and it's sensory overload. A kid in the 1960s, 1970s probably had never seen somebody die. There's probably plenty of people that are grandparents right now that have never seen somebody die, and I don't mean die in like a natural causes way. I mean die in a truly horrific way. And I would be shocked, completely shocked, if there's a single 10-year-old kid that goes to public school in the United States that has not seen a video of somebody dying. this focuses on that. And this, to me, that passage perfectly encapsulates this idea of what I was just talking about. This idea that Karen is watching the news and it doesn't matter what they're saying. All that matters is the images. So they could be explaining something as fictitious, or they could be saying, oh, this is fake news, actually this didn't happen. But all that matters is the visuals. All that matters is the visuals, because that's what we're walking away with. You know, you see a series of images, and they could be about anything, good, bad, neutral, and you form an instant narrative in your mind. That narrative then becomes your truth. Everybody has an alternative truth, and that alternative truth is the only thing that matters to them. You see it even in modern American political terms. You have the people who like Joe Biden, the people who like Donald Trump. Whatever either of those two figures says is the absolute truth, and whatever the other one says is an absolute lie. Of course, the factual truth, you know, the real truth, so to speak, always lies between the poles at some point. You know, maybe it's here, maybe it's here. It doesn't matter really exactly where it is, but it's really never on one of the poles. But today it doesn't matter. Today all that exists is the poles. All that exists is the extremes. Through this novel, you know, we grapple with the idea of, in a world where all that exists are extremes, what is the greatest form of art? And I mean great in the biggest and most effective, not in the best. Is it the novelist or is it the terrorist? So what shapes culture more? Tearing down a skyscraper, killing a bunch of people, or writing a thoughtful piece of literature that examines an issue from 40 different angles? You know, and as we continue through this reading, we're going to incorporate some secondary sources. We're going to really grapple with this issue in depth. We're going to talk about it in depth from both sides. But don't worry, it does start to take a more positive spin. A lot of DeLillo's philosophy behind this novel isn't as grim as it sounds or as it feels at the beginning. There will be an uplifting, not necessarily an uplifting not necessarily an uplifting ending to the novel, but an uplifting central message of this idea between artists and terrorists. Because, you know, in literary fiction, all that matters really is the ideas. The plot is secondary. The plot really only exists to serve the ideas and to get them across and make them digestible, if not entertaining. But we'll also be looking at some counterpoints. You know, I was reading some secondary sources today, trying to do some prep work for the future videos that we're going to be talking about. And yeah, there's a lot of very interesting stuff on this novel, and I'm very excited to share it with you guys. But regardless, I digress. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you shortly where we will be talking about Chapter 3 of Part 1 of Don DeLillo's Mao II. I'll see you then.